All right, welcome to episode 127, The Impact of Globalization on the Demand for Translation Services. Patrick, this is a big one. We've been spending a lot of time on AI. It's kind of nice to maybe talk about the broader market, and I'm sure AI is going to weave its way into this conversation. It's just going to, Patrick.
At some point, yeah.
Yes, collaboration and communication is going to be in there somewhere too, but one of our common themes. But once you get us started, what do you think about this topic?
Yeah, I think it's super interesting. I've been hearing this one since I kind of started my studies of language. And I think as I learned more about the language services industry, I think even going back to when I was in college, they're like, hey, this industry is going to be 5 times as big as it is now in the next 10, 20 years. And I think that still holds true. We found a statistic in our research for the show that says the global language services market is expected to exceed $96 billion by 2032. And I believe that very quickly. Like, that makes total sense to me. I think we're seeing, as we mentioned, AI, a big wave of technology that's hopefully going to basically put some rocket fuel on the language services industry and take it to some really new and cool places.
Absolutely. The whole idea that the world is a smaller place than it used to be. And I think if we, I'm older than you, Patrick, but if we think to our childhood, right? And just if you think of just general availability of products, right? You can be in small town USA or small town somewhere in Europe and get access to things from all over the world, right? Like, I think it's amazing that I can go to my local grocery store, which is not even a specialty grocery store, and get products from Italy and Mexico and Spain. And that growing up, that wasn't necessarily a thing. You'd have to go to a specialty grocery store and maybe they'd have certain things, but it was very limited. So that's a super simple example. But on a global business scale, you look at how your average manufacturer works and where they get their parts, where they're sourcing things from, and the world's definitely a smaller place.
Yeah, even though, yes, you are older than me. I remember growing up, cell phones were becoming a big thing. Like, I used to have to call my friends down the street on both of our home phones to see if they wanted to, go outside and hang out and play. Like, I think even that has changed now to a simple text to someone, and it's like, boom, it takes that takes a lot less time than it did then to kind of, you call them, you get their parents, hey, is so and so home, talk to them for a few minutes, and then go do your thing.
Well, exactly. Communication and collaboration, right? So I'm in a group, the ALCUS, and it's I'm in a couple groups there, a language technology group and just the general group. And this is agency owners that are located all over the world. And we have this, ongoing chat session. It's amazing. You're connecting 20, 30 countries, and people are collaborating and communicating like nothing. And the funny thing is, it's free. It's all internet, right? WhatsApp is not even a charged service, but we all do it through our cell phones. So, again, communication and language, I think if we're thinking of it or looking for an analogy, it's the binding, right? I think it's the binding of all of those activities. So, globalization, I guess. Really, if you think of it, it's really just that increasing interconnectedness of countries through trade, technology, culture, and politics. And, again, politics is definitely the third rail, but you think of things happen here in the US, it affects other countries, right? Now we're talking about trade tariffs, or we're talking about that's going to have impact, right? Those are all things that are going to have impact. Think of some other things in terms of globalization. Gosh, you and I think we've talked about the Squid Game here, right? I think we've talked about that multiple things. Look at the release of that movie globally for Netflix out of Korea. And of course, all the subtitling and the voiceover work and all the stuff that has to happen. I think that's kind of a good example.
Yeah, season 1 of that was maybe in the translation space news, maybe for bad reasons. I know a lot of people weren't necessarily thrilled with the quality of the subtitles, but it's even interesting. Yeah, I watched season 2 around the Christmas time this year when it came out, and I think it defaulted to um, having it dubbed with English subtitles, so I didn't hear anything in Korean. It was all in English to me, which is interesting to see kind of what my settings just automatically flip to. I think Netflix does a good job too of giving you the flexibility. I did pause it after like 5 minutes. I'm like, why is it set up like this? Like, should I have the Korean audio on with English subtitles to kind of get the source speaker inflection and emotion and all of that kind of stuff from it? But that's a worldwide phenomenon, and I know it's smashing all the Netflix records for most watched series in the first couple of weeks. So that I'm sure is largely US driven, but I think also almost anyone who has Netflix knows what Squid Games is at this point.
I mean, absolutely. And, going further with that, right? Think of Apple, think of Microsoft, X or Twitter, or whatever it's called. Those are all global phenomena. Amazon, I mean, how cool is it that, like, this is something that, wouldn't have happened without increasing globalization, is that you can go onto Amazon and buy a gift card and email it to your cousin in Europe, somewhere in Europe, Italy, wherever, and they have a gift card that they can use and buy product. I mean, that's a thing that didn't exist. I mean, I can remember, growing up, unfortunately, with distance, my folks had their parents in Italy, and sometimes they would want to send flowers, or, I mean, it's like finding an FTD place that would like basically send like almost equivalent of like a telegram, to
Either
some florist in Italy through the FTD network. And you'd be surprised if the flowers got there. Obviously, they did, in their own way. But yeah, you wonder, it was probably like a telegram or something
yeah,
ridiculous.
call some neighbors, ask them for a favor.
Just crazy stuff, right? But now that's all like I hope we don't take that for granted. I think sometimes when we get into the machinations of how things work, now we're just like, oh yeah, you just do this. But it's quite amazing, actually. And I think that goes, to the idea of, made in Italy, right, as a brand. It's essentially like a brand. It's like, oh, made in Italy. It evokes things like high design, or something that's very cool. And or if it's food, it's like, oh, this is, something very artisanal. If you're thinking of, Parmigiano, or prosciutto di Parma, or these products that are very much made in Italy. So, I think the broad distribution of those things is quite amazing, obviously.
Yeah, I think that kind of shows authenticity as well. Of like, hey, this is the quality stuff, but it's really cool that now you can basically get that wherever you'd like it, as opposed to only in Italy. It might have been the case in the past.
Let's talk a little bit about social media as well, Patrick. And there's positives and negatives, right? I mean, it's instant, right? So if you think of wartime, right? You think of what's going on in the Middle East right now in Israel, or you think of what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, and pretty much instantly there's material, videos, stories, that, and good or bad, right? Because this is also a place where you can spread falsehoods, right? You can spread good information, misinformation, disinformation, positives and negatives. But it is pretty amazing that, pretty much everyone's a reporter.
Yeah, I mean that just I'm going to spoil it, and this is probably going to be my big takeaway. But I think I know we're going to get into drivers next of why globalization is happening so fast. But I mean, you mentioned social media. I even take it a step higher. Of it's the internet and how quickly everyone can access everything from your pocket. Usually, for those who have smartphones. But I think technology plus internet has really, like, I know we've talked about rocket fuel a few times, but really, really accelerated how quickly things happen and how quickly people can access information.
Absolutely. It has to be the big catalyst. And I think that's also one of the big drivers, right, for where we are now with translation and AI. We said it would creep into this discussion. And it's this demand for instant communication where there is no time to wait for human intervention. And of course, the level of quality isn't quite as important in many of these types of conversations. Like, I don't think anyone's going to get upset if someone's like Facebook post and it does the little automatic translation thing the world's probably not going to stop spinning on its axis because, there was a mistranslation on the post that had to do with, Aunt Zelda posting her banana cake recipe, right? I mean, it's okay. Like, that's a phenomenal spot for instant translation. But I mean, really, I think it's interesting how, big, huge companies like Apple and Toyota and Coca-Cola and, name it, insert large multinational organization here, can't do it unless there's translation. I mean, it has to happen, translation and interpretation, because they have not only internal needs, but external, right? Of course, external, they're selling their product. So, Apple's pretty phenomenal user experience, right? You open up the machine and it says hello in a gajillion languages until you select your language, and then you're on a path, right? And that whole user interface is translated in that language. But I mean,
I think too, like I know you're mentioning kind of the big behemoths, but they put such an emphasis on brand reputation that they want to be known as someone who does these things to help their users. So like it is all about creating those loyal customers or loyal fans. So even from a business perspective, like it makes sense too. Like I'm sure people who have gotten their first Apple product and see the UI in their language are like, wow, this is great. Why would I ever buy technology from another company again? Like that, it just makes not only business sense, but just to keep those customers coming back. Like you want to instantly make them fans of what you're doing, and
I,
that's a very easy way to do it.
I mean, absolutely. Just as little as maybe 15 years ago, Patrick, when we would do sales pitches, it was more about even convincing clients that, hey, this is kind of the path forward. And I remember, giving statistics about how much more the customer is engaged if you provide information in their own language. I don't even think that that's a thing anymore. I don't think anybody talks about it because it's just a foregone conclusion, right?
Mm-hmm.
That, hey, if you're going to do business in X country, whether it's because of regulation and rules or whether it's because it's like it would be silly of us to go into that market without having localized materials. But I mean, even more so, you just think that it has to be for the employer base too, right? For the employer employee relationship. There's manufacturing facilities all across the globe for these big multinationals, and they have to communicate with their clients, and internal and external, of course. So maybe we should talk a little bit about some challenges for globalization. And I think we kind of talked about one, volume and speed, Patrick, right? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned it of anyone can post anything, and I think that's a risk that people need to be aware of when they are consuming content in any language. Is obviously vetting those sources for accuracy. I know that's one that's top of mind to me. But kind of like you said, there's workflows that can get translation at people's fingertips a lot faster, and I think we'll start to see a lot of um, maybe asterisks at the end of it of like I know Facebook does it now already. It's like this was translated, like click to see the original version because they're trying to feed it to you in your own language. But I think having some sort of switchback or quality disclaimer, I think you'll see that more and more just because again, when you do flip the switch and just translate instantly, it's much more likely to have errors than if it was run through a human process.
I, absolutely, Patrick. And I think, we've talked about this before on the podcast about mitigating risk. And I think, that's really the big question that clients have to face is how do I balance speed, quality, and cost? And how do I match that level of service to, how do I match that level of service to the right project? And I mean, we're already seeing it with our customers that the more savvy clients are working their way up and down the scale or the spectrum of levels of service, and they're doing it very intelligently. It's like, well, you know, the corporate equivalent of Aunt Zelda's banana cake recipe, that gets a lower level of service than, say, a message from the CEO on a very sensitive topic, right? I mean, it's just sort of common sense. And I think that's really the key is that for those of us that are in the language service industry, that we have to do a good job of mitigating risk. And I think where the problem is going to be is some of the dishonest, the people that aren't, the people that aren't playing the game correctly, I think, really, and that they always use MT. They don't disclose it to their clients. That they're essentially not providing the levels of transparency that are important.
Yeah, I think that's something I know talked about a lot too, is transparency. And I think those that are transparent and those that are transparent and do that well are really, really setting up the foundation to be super successful going forward. Because I know we talk about market education, buyer education, and all of that stuff. I think another side effect of technology is we're seeing buyers get smarter faster, which is good. So I think they'll kind of maybe be able to see through some of the shenanigans that some companies might be pulling in terms of transparency and level of service.
Absolutely. Why don't we roll through to kind of some, maybe it's just some real life examples of some things where, we've been part of kind of a larger effort to expand markets. And I can think of one right now that we're working on, which is a custom mountain bike manufacturer that's expanding into Germany, and it's really customer demand. They realized that they were all the rage in Germany, and they don't have any resources. You can't.
Just like our show, right?
Exactly. There could be a parallel here. So, they decided, hey, we're gonna localize our website and the ordering process, and we're gonna do the whole thing. I think of a project that I think you were involved in, and this is when we did the very monster sized Salesforce e-commerce site for Costa Glasses, right? I think that was an interesting one where that was, you're doing basically the ordering process, right? I think that's what you were working on there, Patrick.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I think again, where those projects become tricky is I think people want that, let's call it a website, translated very quickly. And we kind of have to set those expectations with the client, again, going through levels of service, all of that. But really setting those expectations of like, okay, how long did it take for you to make the source of this website? And as someone who has built websites for clients now in my current role, that's usually about 9 months of work to get a pretty solid website put together. Not to say that translation should take 9 months, but I think still recognizing that there's process to that. You need to do round trip testing, all that fun stuff, deal with text expansion or contraction. But those, when the dust settles on them and they're all done, it is pretty cool to just have that option to either change the language flag or be auto detected by your IP to determine what language to serve you. It's really cool when you see that language switcher on a site, and it works really well.
And, another thing, Patrick, is even the business solution side of it, right? It's like, not that that's necessarily why clients come to us, is to solve those business problems, but I always like to chat through those things with our clients just so they're prepared, because we do have other services that can certainly help. But hey, if someone fills out the form that we just translated, well, who's going to respond?
Mm-hmm.
How does that look? And how quickly do you want to respond? And do you need some translation tools, automatic or otherwise, that'll handle the translation of the incoming request? And how are you going to respond? Or does that need to be routed to a distributor? Or, just going through some of the business process. And by the way, if you put, a toll-free number there, does that toll-free number work in the countries you're targeting? Or are you going to put a local number? What are you going to do? Like, just walking through all those sort of things. And a website certainly drives those conversations.
Yeah, and I think that's where, I know we talk about this a lot, but I think that's where the value of a good, one, project manager, but two, partner, vendor, whatever you want to call them, will come in and say, hey, have you thought about these things? Because, like, yes, we should solve the problem in front of us, but if we're then leaving gaps and it's causing other problems, we really want to take that full 360-degree view rather than just say, okay, client, yes, we can do the one thing that you asked for.
Absolutely. Moving to another use case that I can think of, which is kind of cool, is we've talked a little bit about the chat tools that we're providing now, and one via partnership in larger installations like Salesforce and such, and others like our own chat tool, which is incredibly configurable, right, to a business need. And I think that's like a really good, I'm going to call that like a binder around other services. And if it's about delivery and about instant delivery, and that's something that, again, wasn't available just a few years ago, but now technology has made that happen. And I think the other one that I wanted to talk about, which is, a lot of our clients, is employee comms and how important that is and all the different things we do there, right, Patrick? Like, I mean, what are some of the things that fall under, so project types that fall under that?
Yeah, I think we've seen all sorts of things. I know a few projects that I worked on before were a client of ours was acquiring another company, I think out of the Netherlands, and they got this huge library of documents from them. And they're like, we have no idea what any of this is. And we need to know, just like doing their due diligence, like it could be any sort of vital business documents, but they're like, yeah, we don't read Dutch, so can you help us out here? And I think with that large of a volume, I think we recommended, just a pure machine translation pass at the first one. Then they can identify those documents, whether it's, a project chart or whatever kind of documents that they're getting from the company that they're acquiring, just so they know what they're looking at. And then they identified a smaller subset of crucial documents where we then did a human workflow on those, because they were a bit more sensitive, high value information or whatever it might have been. But just doing that machine translation pass, yes, it was a huge volume of content, but it didn't take that long. You just have to parse all the files, run them through, spit them out. And then they got a lot more value out of those human translations for that subset of highly valuable documents.
That's a phenomenal use case, Patrick, and kind of falls under sort of legal and M&A and mergers and acquisitions. But we've also done videos and subtitling, right? So if you think of that's a use case where translation come in, and that world has gotten fairly complex because, again, the interweaving of AI voices and AI transcription and the service level discussion has become even more important in that realm. And knowledge bases, so technology, we've created a connector to SharePoint, and of course there's connectors that others offer to systems like Notion and Zendesk, and even Salesforce has a knowledge base section. So these connections to these knowledge bases and getting these translated, the whole reason is, right, is you want your employees, no matter where they're located, to be on the same footing as the employees that are located at headquarters, wherever headquarters may be. So let's look ahead, Patrick. What do you, the future of translation in a globalized world? I mean, who would have thought? I mean, back when you were at U of I, maybe you were thinking this. I don't know. You're thinking that there's going to be little computer bots doing a lot of this at the time, or maybe
I mean,
you were, maybe you weren't.
We did have machine translation already, so that one, I know we've talked about that at
We
length.
should remind everyone, since 1965 or whatever it
right.
is,
So,
machine translation's been here a long time.
Again, some level of automation has always been here, but I think it is really cool to see kind of how far the industry can take that. I do think even in the last few years when I was working on website translations, I think we wisely kind of had the stance of too much automation can be bad. So like having those humans in the loop or having quality checks at certain points, and I think kind of insisting on that. And again, depends on the use case. I think now we're kind of broadening that toolkit of like, hey, okay, this use case, it's actually fine to not have a human in the loop because, like we said, low value, low visibility, whatever it might be. But I think, again, that's between the provider and the buyer to really come to an agreement of what level of risk you're comfortable with, as we talked about, and really what the recommendation is from a level of service perspective. But I think we talked about, I think last episode too, of just a really seeing all the cool different types of things that can be translated that may have not been translatable in the past. I know we talked a lot about social media and things like that, but again, a lot of those can be translated really at the flip of a switch based on the tech they have behind it. So I think we'll see a lot more of that, of kind of, hey, this was instantly translated, and hopefully a disclaimer that like, okay, flip it back to the source language because I didn't love the translation.
And I think that's the key, right? We've talked about it before, is that, I think corporations and translators and interpreters. I know we have listeners from both sides of the discussion. I think all of us have to be calm, cool, and collected, and know this is not the end of our industry. I think it's actually going to catapult the industry forward. There will be, certainly our jobs will all change. We'll be working on different things. We'll be working on the same things we've worked on in the past in a different way, right? These are all things. But I mean, I'm inspired by the fact that, I just had a call this week with one of our large retailer clients that, never really wanted to talk about AI. And now suddenly they want to talk about AI because they're realizing that, hey, we need to embrace this. We need to figure out where it fits in our organization and how we're going to do this in a thoughtful and consistent way and deploy it in the right spots. And I think the only thing we can guarantee, Patrick, is that if we're sitting here 1 year from now doing this podcast again, that things will be different. I think that's the only thing that we can guarantee is that things will change.
Change is the only constant, right?
That's it. I think that's the only thing. And, I would basically challenge all of our listeners to just think about in their own way how incorporating technology and incorporating language can improve their business, right? And you brought up a great example, Patrick. You're starting to say it's like, yeah, this doesn't just affect the Fortune 100. Remember, as an LSP, we have tiny clients. We have clients that run a local bakery that has 50 employees that are, has Spanish as their first language. So we help with procedures and policies, and guess what? That has impact on those 50 people. Certainly they're not a Fortune 100 company, but I like to think that in our own way that we impact their revenue and their earnings in a positive way.
Yeah, I know you give the example of you helping that Italian speaker at the bank when you were growing up too. But I think like local banks, like things like that, I know we do tend to focus on the behemoths, but I do think that there's a huge local impact as well because I know we find in the Chicagoland and the Wisconsin area, there's very large pockets of, like in Chicago, there's a huge Polish population. I know Wisconsin has a lot of immigrant communities as well. But I think it's just so cool that, like, yes, Apple and Coke and Toyota are doing all these cool things in the language space, but like you mentioned, there's a lot of local impact as well on those regional businesses.
Absolutely. So Patrick, biggest takeaway. I know you kind of, little spoiler on that, haven't changed it, but what's your takeaway?
Yeah, I think we kind of touched at the top as well of globalization. I don't think is going to go backwards. I think it's only going to continue to have everything be more instant, more accessible, more right at our fingertips. So I think those that put out content or information in languages that their audience want or need are going to just set themselves up to be a bit ahead of their competition.
Definitely. And for me, the biggest takeaway is just that, change is inevitable, and we just have to be calm, cool, and collected and understand our own part in the bigger, larger global scheme of things, and really just do the best we can with the budget we're given. If I'm a user of translation, the budget that I'm given or the budget that I have, what's the best that I can do? And hopefully I can work with my language service provider to figure out what that mix of those service levels looks like. So, all right. Well, for this episode of Translation Confidential, this is Peter and Patrick signing off.